So as many of my long-term viewers already know, I am very interested in the criminal justice system. This is why I cover a lot of cases, and a lot of these cases specifically, in my opinion, have broader policy implications, or they're in the news because the facts of the case are disputed, and I think that they're worth talking about. However, sometimes what I like to talk about, and what we're going to go over today, are cases that I think actually stretch the limit of what should and shouldn't be prosecutable. Because there's a case out of Las Vegas which I think really does bump up against what should or shouldn't be prosecutable, and I want to talk about it and I want to get your opinion on it. But I also want to remind you guys that actually liking the video, and I hate asking at the beginning of the video, does help the channel, so if you could do that, that's what my engagement people are telling me to do, I'd appreciate it. But before we get into this story, this video is in fact sponsored, so let me chuck it to the sponsor, then we'll bring it back over here and we'll talk about it on the other side. A new survey shows that 52% of Americans are currently trying to lose weight, but the thing is, it ain't easy. If it was, we would have a lot less people trying to get control over it. This is why you need a boost. Go over to ketowithjustice.com and get this amazing keto powder. It helps boost your chances of losing weight by elevating your ketones, and you could try this 60-day money-back guarantee for 51% off at ketowithjustice.com. Start meeting your weight loss goals today. ketowithjustice.com. So the case that we're going to talk about today actually revolves around the tragic death of 15-year-old Anthony De La Torre. And for those of you who are wondering, because we cover a lot of black crime stories on this channel, everything about this case involves Latinos. So my people are getting thrown under the bus because everybody in this case was in the wrong to varying degrees. And yeah, that means that all Latinos, including myself, are of course guilty, because that's how identity works in the United States of America. Now let's move on. So on this day, Anthony De La Torre was trying to do a skateboarding trick. He wanted to ride on the back of a Jeep and be driven around to do something or other. Again, not a big understander of skateboarding. So what they ended up doing, and by the way, he was being supervised by somebody who's described as his 19-year-old aunt. I'm not sure if it's cousin that is called the aunt or it's actually an aunt. It is possible to have aunts that are younger than you, but whatever. And she wanted him to be able to do this trick. So what they end up doing is approaching a woman called Anias Hernandez, pictured here, who was recently arrested for her role in today's incident. And essentially what they do is they ask this woman if she wouldn't mind being the driver while this 15-year-old hung on the back of the car and drive down the road so he can do whatever skateboarding trip, because they thought this would be a fun time for all parties involved. However, Hernandez was not interested in this. She felt like this stunt was incredibly dangerous. She did not want to participate in this stunt, so she said, I will not be the person driving you in this action because I don't want to take responsibility for it, and I don't know you all that well or whatever, but understandably, she did not participate in what was going on here. Now, this is where the aunt actually comes into play. Destiny Jimenez, who actually is the aunt in question, the 19-year-old, decided to make a different offer to Hernandez, and essentially what she said was that she would get behind the wheel and let her nephew ride on the back of the car in order to perform this stunt, so hopefully a good time would be had by all. And reluctantly, what ended up happening was Hernandez agreed to this arrangement, turned over the keys to her vehicle, and the 15-year-old gripped the back of the vehicle. They go to do the trick, and ultimately this ends up leading to the 15-year-old's death, who I believe somehow found himself underneath the vehicle. And by the way, the occupants of the vehicle thought they ran over a bump, but they actually ran over the skateboarder, the 15-year-old who was doing the trick. And as I told you in the beginning of the story, he ultimately ended up dying.
New this morning, nurses and doctors at Sunrise Hospital honoring a 15-year-old who was hit by a car more than a week ago and passed away. This is the honor walk. The family of Anthony De La Torre sharing this video here with 8 News Now. The teen died just a short time after that video was taken, his organs being donated to save other lives.
Now what's interesting, and we found out later about Destiny Jimenez taking the wheel of this car, was that she didn't have a driver's license. She was also drinking. She was also smoking marijuana at the time of this incident. So, by no way, shape, or form should this 19-year-old have been behind the wheel of any vehicle under any circumstances, but specifically when you're drunk and high, that tends to make the situation worse. Now, needless to say, Destiny Jimenez was promptly arrested when she confessed to the police that she did not have a license, that she had been drinking, and that she had been using marijuana. And the charges for Jimenez are as follows. First and foremost, she had a DWI that resulted in a death. Obvious, makes sense. We all understand that. She also had charges related to driving without a license. As I told you before, she doesn't have a license. This also makes perfect sense. And normally, for a lot of people, this is where the story should end. We have a situation where somebody acted totally irresponsibly. She ended up driving a vehicle, allowed a 15-year-old to attach himself to the vehicle, and then you compound that irresponsible behavior with the fact that she was drinking, and with the fact that she was high, and with the fact that she didn't even have a license in the first place, and then that resulted in the death of that 15-year-old. And by the way, it was gruesome. He was injured. He was bleeding from his head. He ultimately ended up passing 4 days later in the hospital. So obviously it's a tragic scenario, and it happened in a neighborhood where the family was. So when the police arrived on the scene, he was surrounded by family that had to see him in that state. My heart goes out to everybody in the family, and we all understand why the charges were pressed against Jimenez. However, I told you that this story was not about Jimenez. It was about Hernandez, the owner of the vehicle, who turned over the keys to the 19-year-old, because one of the most recent developments is the fact that the police in Las Vegas decided that she was also criminally culpable for turning over the keys to this 19-year-old. In fact, Hernandez, not the driver, but the owner of the vehicle, has now had criminal charges filed against her for neglect of a child and abuse of a child, and she was recently arrested on March 29th after the police spotted her, because apparently they decided to press the charges months ago, but they only spotted this woman recently, and now she is under arrest. And this brings us to a perplexing situation. Is Hernandez responsible for the death of this child, for the abuse of this child, for the neglect of this child, by simply turning over her car keys to the 19-year-old Jimenez? Now, let's grant the premise that she had no idea that Jimenez was drunk. She had no idea that Jimenez was high. She had no idea that Jimenez did not have a license. However, we have to acknowledge that she refused herself to drive the 15-year-old in the manner that was described, but was happy or reluctantly turned over her keys to the 19-year-old to do so. So she knew what they were about to do when she turned over the car keys to this 19-year-old. That ultimately ended up resulting in the death of the 15-year-old. But the question is, could you be held criminally responsible for abuse and neglect of a child by simply turning over the car keys, getting out of the driver's seat, and getting into the passenger seat of a vehicle when you have a pretty good idea that something dangerous related to a child is going to happen? Because that's the theory of the prosecution in this case, that this woman, who did not want to be the driver because she did not want to take accountability for this 15-year-old child while he wanted to do something dangerous, ended up turning over to a member of the child's family, somebody who was in a position of authority over the child, so that she could assume the risk. And thus, the dangerous thing that, by the way, she knew was dangerous, which is why she wouldn't do it herself, ultimately ended up happening and ultimately led to this 15-year-old's death. And therefore, the prosecution is saying that she should have known better. She shouldn't have put her car in that scenario in the first place. And she is criminally chargeable for neglect of a child that's not hers, that she was not responsible for, and abuse of a child. Now, a lot of people would go and say, hey, look, the outcome is really bad in this scenario. 15-year-old ended up being killed. That's the worst possible outcome. And they kind of end the conversation right there. In fact, that's what the Las Vegas prosecution is doing. But I have issues with the idea of you being able to neglect a child that's not yours, that you have not taken responsibility for. However, that is counterable by saying that as soon as she put her car in that situation, which is her personal property or private property, property, that ultimately ends up leading to her assuming responsibility, even if she didn't know it. But as far as the abuse allegations, that also is a little bit weird, because if you told me the 19-year-old abused the 15-year-old, somebody that she was in a position of authority of as an adult member of the family, then no questions asked, I would agree with that. But is the abuse in this scenario the mere act of lending your vehicle, turning over your keys to somebody who intends to do something that is dangerous? Or are we just saying that we're going to charge with abuse because this woman was involved in a situation and that ultimately ended up resulting in the death of the 15-year-old? Because our criminal justice system is supposed to have laws that are sensible, clear, and logical and consistent. They're not supposed to be laws that are applied selectively in unusual scenarios as soon as there's a negative outcome that we don't like. So put a different way, if this woman had turned over her key, this guy grabs on the back of the Jeep, they do a cell phone video of it, the whole thing goes off without a hitch, they get out of the car, they laugh, they have a good time, that gets uploaded onto the internet, the police end up seeing the video, they know the neighborhood, they know all the faces involved. Would you be okay with this woman being charged, absent the death? Because let's be clear, she's not really being charged in the death of the child, at least from the initial abuse and neglect charges. She's being charged for her actions with those same charges. Do you think it is inherently abusive and neglectful to the point where you would do charges regardless of the outcome of this? Or is your decision outcome based? Now, I hate videos where people just ask questions but don't give answers, so I'm actually going to tell you the answer to this question, or at least what the answer to this question should be. And that is that this woman is in fact perfectly chargeable with not only neglect but abuse according to the criminal codes at play, because in the state they do not require intent to do harm as a prerequisite in order to get a conviction on these charges. The state only requires that the person engage in acts intentionally that result in the harm of the child. So according to the law that is being applied by the Las Vegas prosecutors, she is 100% chargeable because she intentionally turned over the keys when she knew a dangerous stunt was going to occur, and that resulted in the harm of the child. In fact, an example that is often used by Las Vegas lawyers that I found on this very helpful page is as follows. Max lives in Las Vegas. Max belts his son with the intent to discipline him. However, Max belts him so hard, the child's spinal cord gets damaged. Max can be charged with child abuse even though he had no intent to cause such harm. Now think about the implications of that. Striking somebody inadvertently with a belt because of the damage would result in a child abuse charge, even though the inherent danger of disciplining your child with a belt is far less significant than the inherent danger of this stunt. And we have actions from this woman that shows that she was not only fully aware of this inherent danger, but actively sought to personally avoid being the driver so that she would not be found responsible for this danger, yet she lent the car. That is the theory of the prosecution. And the state laws that the Las Vegas prosecutors are using, what is in play, require an intentional action, then a negative consequence, and one could easily argue that both are in fact present here. Now I'm actually going to link to the resources that you can look over, and you could examine the charges and you could examine the circumstances, which will also be linked in the description of this case, so you can make your own decision, because I am curious what you guys think about this case, what you think about Nevada's intentional or general intent laws in terms of child abuse, because I find this interesting as an edge case, even though I do think the law permits the prosecution as charged. But again, I open up the floor to you guys, because it's not necessarily what's in the law, which is clear in my opinion, but it's what you guys think and believe about the law and whether or not you think it's justified. So let me know down in the comments below. If you liked the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about a strangely charged case out of the state of Nevada. Till next time.